Okay, B'siyata D'Shmai, Basar B'chalav number 6, one topic. That's the topic of Maamid. The concept of Maamid is clear in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah and Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph that appears in your booklet. The Gemara says that when one does Maamid, we'll describe the science in a moment. The Gemara says, "Kivan du ukmi kamokim chashiv le'keman de'isali isura be'enei." The process of cheese making that we'll describe in detail, that process has a component in which the act of taking the cheese and putting it through a chemical process, the item that initiates that chemical process, which is often the stomach of an animal, is chashuv, and it's considered as if the isser is be'en. That lashon, that the isser is be'en, so the drisha tells us in Simin Pei Zayin by us, in Os Tes, the language of the drisha is as follows. The drisha says, "To davar ma'imid chashuv be'en ve'eno batal." So the animal that is impacting the cheese at times is going to be considered be'en. That taste is going to be considered be'en, and it's not going to be batal. What is the mitzius of cheese making? So first of all, I encourage you looking it up on your own and adding more to what I will say. What I have on the outline is the Oz V'Hadar's very nice introduction. So at each stage of each sif that we're going to be learning, I'll also give you the Oz V'Hadar's description. Ikar derech hamadas gvina l'tzarech asiyas gvina. The process of cheese making, haisa al yidei nesinas or kevas behema, o mitz keva betoch hachalav. That a cheese, of course, is curdled milk. That when there is a process in which the milk is curdled, so then in such a case the milk turns into cheese. How? Ki ora keva yesh bo chamitzut hapoelet gibun. There is a chemical. Chamitzut is very vague. It means something sharp, but in English it's rennet. For those Nativari guys, not rennet, but rennet. Rennet. That's a chemical. Ironically, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's amazing world is that this chemical is found in the stomach of many animals, particularly a cow. So this, ironically, you have the meat of the cow, the stomach, has a chemical inside, and that chemical causes the milk to turn into cheese. Umakrish es chilkei hagvina shebechalav. So the Gemara tells us that when it came to why does it appear in Avodah Zarah, gvinas akum is aser, that you can't have the cheese of a guy because the guy is going to be maamid that cheese in nevela. And when he's maamid into nevela, so then in such a case, it's going to aser the cheese, because even if there's a kolshu, there's now a kolshu of nevela inside of the cheese. That's the reason why gvinas akum is aser. Okay, with that introduction, we're ready to begin the halachos, but I'm going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to start with Sif Yud Aleph and then we are up to ostensibly Sif Tes, but the best way to learn it, in my humble opinion, is to start with Sif Yud Aleph. Because we started with the case in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Daf Lamed Hey, we started with the case of a nevela. And what we're going to see is the distinction between Maamid by nevela and Maamid with Basar B'chalav. So we know that Maamid, if you are Maamid cheese inside of a nevela, so then in such a case it's going to be aser. Haraya, they asered all Goyish cheese because of the concern that they were Maamid in nevela. Zak te'elegim mechaber im hemig vina ba'ar kevas kshera yesh batam basar asura v'im lav muteres. So the halacha, we have a reisha and a seifa. The reisha is Basar B'chalav, and that is no longer the case of Maseches Avodah Zarah. We were just Messiahim in the Daf Yomi. We're moving from Seder Nezikin today to Kadshin, and that's going to have Chulin. So we start with the case of Avodah Zarah. The case of Avodah Zarah is that it's going to be aser to be Maamid in or nevela, but the case of chulin is going to be the following. In chulin, there's a debate about the gersos in the Gemara, but at the end of the day, in chulin the halacha is going to be that if you're Maamid gvina ba'ar kevas kshera, then it's not aser b'chol shehu. Even though we said from the drisha that Maamid is so chashuv that's considered as if be'en, for some reason over here, when it comes to basar b'chalav, it'll only make the cheese aser if it gives off tam basar into the cheese, like the regular rules of basar b'chalav. Continues the mechaber, v'im lav muteres, avla Maamid bar kevas nevela treifu behemet tmeya oiser b'cholshu. But Maamid is going to be aser. Why? Says the Ramah, mishum de davar aser ba'atzmai u'Maamid afilu be'elef loy batel. Because the power of Maamid, the power of the idea that something that really constructs its omeid. What was the lashon that we had in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah? Kivan de okim kamokim. That at the end of the day, the cheese is being created through the rennet. So then in such a case, that is so chashuv, the little bit that it puts inside is so chashuv, so then in such a case, it's not going to be batel. So that's the rule of the Gemara. So then the question becomes, so why is it different when it comes to basar b'chalav? Says the Shach in Sifkat and Lamed Hey. If you think about it, that was what the Shach is going to say is essentially our hakdama shir from basar b'chalav. Says the Shach, Hachilik bazeh kasu haposkim, de'ar kevas ksheira me'achar shu mutar b'fnei atzmai v'les bei isur el mishum chiburo im agvina. When you're talking about basar b'chalav, so the arkevas ksheira is kosher, the milk is kosher. There isn't any iser except les be'eser al mishum chaveru magvina. Kol emas the lo you have time ala basar b'chalavu. You can't say it's basar b'chalav. It's true. The arkevas ksheira was Maamid the gvina. It was Maamid the gvina. But mehechi teisi, that's going to be basar b'chalav. It's true that Drisha taught us as a davar chashiv. It's true. Kimin de okim kamokim. Yosef Mordechai had an interesting svar of how kimin de okim ba'okim, what it means. But all those svaras might be true, but at the end of the day, it's not basar b'chalav. If it's not basar b'chalav, so then in such a case, halach would be mutter. Aval or nevelu ki yotzei she'aser me'atzmai kimin shu Maamid on a run kilu iser be'en. But when it comes to nevela, so there the nevela itself is aser. So the moment in which that nevela has any hashpa of ha'amada into the gvina, so then in such a case it's going to be aser. You can't say that the basar had hashpa into the chalav because it was Maamid. If al pi halacha, it's not called basar v'chalav. It has no significance whatsoever. Okay, so this is the yesod number one in regards to Maamid. Now we're ready to go back to Seif Tes. In order to understand Seif Tes, we need to know, as you have in your outline, Gemara on Kuf Tes Zayin speaks about Cholav Hanimtza B'Kevas B'Kevasa Shel Behema Shenishkata. So if you have milk that's found inside of the stomach of an animal that has been geshachtin properly, and the discussion in the Gemara, discussion of Gersos, etc. There are a lot of complicated issues, some of which I was zocheh to discuss with some of you in Seder. In Halacha Shir, we'll focus a little bit more on the Halacha, but it'll be my pleasure to discuss anything in the Sugya. But LeHalacha, there's a fascinating debate about how do you look at milk that is inside of an animal stomach. We're no longer talking about the rennet, Rabbosai. It gets a little confusing. We're now talking about topic number 2 is how do you look at milk that's sitting in an animal's stomach after the animal is slaughtered. You open up the animal and there's milk sitting there. The Gemara V'Amevin Yom does talk about, depends on where it was yonik from. Was it yonik from a animal tmeya or kshera and so on? For our purposes right now, what we're discussing is we're talking about looking at the status of the milk, particularly what happens if the milk has already coagulated. In other words, essentially the conceptual question is, when do we say that milk loses its identity of milk when it's in the stomach of the one that drank it, and it becomes part of the identity of the stomach itself? So over here, I wrote this out in the outline. We have a three-way machlokes. Rashi Rif and Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam. The Shita of Rashi is that chalav, once that's in the keva, is considered chalav gamor. Whether it's karush, whether it's salul, it's always considered until it becomes mamish stomach. So then it's considered until it's entirely ingested, and then it goes into the bloodstream and the digestive system. It's always, as long as it's something's apart in the stomach, it's going to be considered milk. The Rif and the Rambam are the opposite extreme. They say that the halacha is that's considered parish ba'alma. That the moment in which it enters the stomach, it's parish ba'alma. That's a question of girsos, as the Rosh points out over there on that Gemara on Kuf Tez Zayin, Maamid Beis. That's a big question of how you read the Gemara, and again, it relates to whether the ksher was yonak mea treifa or a treifa that was yonak mea kshera. Ayin sham. Finally, the last shita is the shita Rabbeinu Tam, and Rabbeinu Tam is mechalik between the chalav being karush or the chalav being tzalul. So those are the three shitas. What the poskim over here in Sif Tes and Sif Yud focus on before we come back to the sugya of Maamid is this question. And then that will also impact halachos of Maamid as well. So now we're going to discuss issue number 2 is chalav animtza b'keva. Zaktei l'gemechaber chalav animtza b'keva. Ein a chalav. If it's considered in the keva, it's not considered chalav. It's pir shabalma. Umutul vashel bo basar fil tzal shabo. And that is the shita of the Rif and the Rambam. V'yesh misha oser. And there are those who say that it is aser. If the chalav is found as chalav, the halacha is that it's going to be aser. Now, the mechaber is a little bit vague. You could say the mechaber holds that it's always aser. In other words, what does aser mean in our context? You can't cook it with meat, period. But the Shach points out you shouldn't read the mechaber this way. The mechaber is going to be following that in-between position that we mentioned of Rabbeinu Tam. Says the Shach, in Sifkat and Chafei, V'yesh Misha Oser, Pirish Bitzalul, K'moshe Kasav L'il, B'simin Pei Aleph, Sivav. V'al zeh Kasav Rabba Hagah V'chein Nogin. So Ramah says V'chein Nogin. In other words, Divrei Torah Aniyim B'makom Echad V'ashirim B'makom Acher. For some reason, the Mechaber over here relies on what he had written in Pei Aleph Vav, and that is that he's not paskening that it's always Aser, but rather he's paskening that it's going to be Aser when it's Solul, as opposed to when it's Karish. Yes, Moshe?
He's not asking like the Rambam.
Oh, okay. Very good. Thank you for correcting me. That's not what the Shach and the Ramah are passing. Correct. Thank you. No, that's a very good point. Moshe is pointing out that Me'ikr Dedina, that's important, Me'ikr Dedina, the Mechaber passing like the first day of the Yesh Misha Oser is B'Torah is Yesh Misha. When I said when he's passing Yesh Misha Oser, he means, like he had said earlier, in regards to the chiluk between Karish and Sol. Good point. So v'chein nogin u'kasav Ramah, when the Shach says that, he's talking about aliba de Ramah u'diimei and the consensus of Psak. So again, to be 100% clear, 3 deos, Mechaber Paskins, that the halacha is that's always not considered milk. He quotes a Yesh Misha Oser that says Machmir. What's that case? Says the Shach, the Yesh Misha Oser is actually not saying that it's always going to be Oser. It's only going to be Oser when it's Solul as opposed to Karish. And when I was talking about Psak, I was talking about the Psak of the Shach and the Ramah, as we're about to see. Great. Okay, so that is Sif Tes. Continues the Mechaber in Sif Yud. Cholav hanimtza b'keva. We're going to start without the Ramah. Now we take these two halachos, what we learned in Sif Tes and what we learned in Sif Yud Aleph, and we add them together, and we get to Sif Yud. Then they come together into Sif Yud. So says the Mechaber, Cholav hanimtza b'keva, shenimlach b'kevaso, o she'omad bo yom echad, aser lahamid bo gvina. If you have cholav that was found in the keva, so then in such a case, that's milk. But what's the problem? That's milk if it was tzalul. And according to Mechaber, it's totally fine. It's not a problem at all. So according to Ramah, it's considered milk. According to Mechaber, it's pirsha ba'alma. But now we've got a new problem. Shenimlach b'kevasa, it was salted in the stomach. It wasn't just found there, it was salted. O or it was kavush. Aser lahamid bo. Now here, I got stuck when I was learning it the first time, so a basic piece was missing for me, so I don't want it to be missing for you. The Taz, Sifkat and Taz, explains Asr lahamid bo gvina. What we're saying is as follows, that the milk that was sitting in the stomach, says a Taz, Pirush lo yitem also chalav shenimnach bekeva ohuma biyom echad lechalav b'shvil sheyakbil lasas imenu gvina. The power of rennet is as follows, that once the rennet gets inside of the chalav, you could take that chalav and then put it into other chalav, and that will be enough to initiate the curdling process of cheese making. So that's what asr lahamid bo means, that this milk is going to be asr. Why is this milk asr? Because this milk has tam keva inside. It has tam keva inside, so then in such a case, it's going to be asr. Oh, okay. The Ramah continues, and the Ramah points out that the Mechaber's language is asr lahamid bo. You could read that the Mechaber holds, and we're going to see in a moment, this is how the Shach understands the Mechaber, that's only asr lechatchila. Because the Mechaber's own shita is that this is considered parush. If it's considered parush, so then in such a case, it could very well be that the halacha is that it's not going to be considered asr, as if it absorbed the tam basar. It's mamish stam pirsha ba'alma, and if it's pirsha ba'alma, it could very well be that bidi eved it's going to be mutter. However, lichatchila it's going to be asr. Take a look at the shach in Chavtes. Asr lahamid bo mashma de'ein chiluch ben karsh l'tzalol v'hainu lichatchila. This is lechatchila. Lechatchila, there's no distinction between karish and salul. Va'afa gav the mutal vashel bekarish afil lechatchila. Shach is bothered, but the halacha is that when it comes to karush, you're allowed to even cook the karush with meat. So what's the problem if we're talking about chalav that's karush? So what would be the problem to be Maamid gevina? Notice the Mechaber did not differentiate between chalav hanimtza bekeva, whether it was chalav karush or not. Ukemoshe kasanu b'sifkatan hachafei hasam shani she'en kan iser el mishum chalav akeva v'kivan de karishu kipirsha aval hacha nehi de pirshahu mikol makom kivan de nimlach osham eisleis bekeva al kain kibla tami or akeva ulahachi aser lachatchil lahem ibogvinas. So says the Shach that this din of the Mechaber is really only lechatchila. It's not b'diavad. Why? Because the Mechaber already said that we view this whole concoction as being stam parish ba'alma. If it's parish ba'alma, the Shach assumes not only is it parish vis-a-vis cooking it with meat, then even any hamada that's done afterwards is not going to be considered hamada with basar. It's stam pirsha. That's what the Shach assumes. And therefore the Shach says that what we're talking about is only a din lechatchila. Miolini diyevet das hamechaber b'sifro beis Yosef diyesh lahater b'cholinian ulakach sasam kan ve'ein kain das harav harama. So the shita of the mechaber is as follows, according to the way the Shach understands it, that when you have the chalav inside of the keva, the chalav inside the keva is going to be considered pirsha ba'alma. Certainly, when it is karush, it's going to be considered pirsha ba'alma, and the pashas of the mechaber is even when it's salul, and therefore it's going to be mutter to cook it with milk. However, lichatchila we're machmir not to use it to take the milk and use it to curdle cheese. It looks like it sounds like it's a din that it's too connected to the stomach. Even though, really, according to the Shach, once it's pirsha ba'alma, then it's not going to be even a problem to use it to curdle cheese. Just like the halach would be that you could use any chemical to curdle. So too, that's not an ochel anymore. It's pirsha. So the fact that it has rennet inside is not going to affect the curdling b'diavad. But lichatchila, it still looks like something that it had rennet, and therefore the mechaber is machner. Okay, that's the sheet of the mechaber asal hamim b'gvina. However, yes.
It can't be tam in the Pirush Haram.
Very good. So l'chura, that's what he's saying. We're going to keep on moving in a couple of shachs, and it's a fair question.
I think the Beis Yosef said that.
What's that?
I think somewhere in one of the Beis Yosef said that.
That you have to assume that. Right, that's what you have to say. There's a shach later on, Lamed Aleph, that you could take a look at Zifkat and Lamed Aleph. That's why you mentioned the Beis Yosef. He says, "In David das mechar b'sifrei Beis Yosef." Right. Right.
And the chomer is just because it's too close?
The chomer is it's too close. That's how I understood what the chomer is. The Ramah continues, but the Ramah learns differently. The Ramah says, "V'mehemid bo imhu hatzalul oser kol agvinos." Ad. So the Ramah disagrees before the ad. The Ramah held that if it's tzalul, it's chalav l'mahadrin. If it's chalav l'mahadrin, so then it has rennet from an animal l'mahadrin. If it has rennet from an animal l'mahadrin, so then if you mix that with other gevina, so then you were maamid from the rennet of a behema, and then the halacha is that's going to be aser. So that's what the shach is learning. That's what the Ramah is adding. The mechaber just said eser lehemid bo. So the Ramah needs to add, but if it's salul, so then it not only lechatchila is it going to be aser, but it's going to be aser b'di'eved as well. By the way, in regards to your question, Uriel, I've jotted on the side of my Shulchan Aruch from the Darkei Moshe as well. The lashon is L'fisha dino kiparish gam tama basar misalek mishum sheyesh alav din prisha. So that's what you were quoting for the Beis Yosef as well, that it doesn't have that din. Fine.
Why
Once it's parush, so then once it's parush, then the rennet doesn't have its chashivas either. In other words, the tam basar from the tam rennet of the basar loses its chashivas. That was the mashal that I had given to a chemical. Let's say nowadays they have chemicals that also are curdle. So it's essentially al pi halacha. It's not a dvar ochel. It's not a dvar ochel. It doesn't even matter where it got its chemical from.
When we said lechatchila, it's no good because it looks too close.
Yes.
That's a marasayan issue.
I think it's midrabanan. Midrabanan. They just didn't want people to be maamid in a keva in general, and even if what had happened was that you weren't being maamid in the cave, but it was parish that had taken from the cave, and nevertheless they were machmer for that as well. Okay. The Ramah continues and says, but it will be mutter if there's shishim. Ad sheyeh shishim b'chalav shemin neged hakeva hasura. But if there's shishim of the chalav keneged hakeva, now what the Ramah's vague over here, I've jotted on the side of my Shulchan Aruch, he doesn't mean you estimate the chalav keneged hakeva. He means the chalav that was in the keva. In other words, you have chalav of heter. You added chalav from the keva. It's very unclear. There are quite a few things that are unclear over here. So what the Ramah means is he means that the chalav that came from the keva, so then if there's 60 times of the kosher to the one that was from the keva, so then it's mutter. So then it's going to be mutter. The Shach asks a bomb kasha on this, Rabbi Osai. We set ourselves up well for the Shach's kasha. What did we learn as a din of Maamid? The din of Maamid that we learned is that Maamid is afilu be'elef lo batal, because it's chashuv. So here you have Maamid from the keva. So if you have Maamid from the keva, so halacha should be aser afilu be'elef. So the answer to that question is similar to what we said before about the difference between basar b'chalav and nevela. But let's see it inside in the shach. Take a look at the shach lamid. Achei shishim b'chalav klomer. Achei shishim b'chalav shehem nasu gvinos neged hachalav she bekeva shenes rekem b'shum basar b'chalav. And that was what I had spelled out before, that you have 60 of the kosher milk to 60 times to the amount of milk that was sitting in the keva. Ulechora kasha. Ask the Shach, Amai Sagi B'Shishim, Ha'chalav Shebekeva Asar Me'atzmo Shenasas Nevela. So here, the Shach asks it the following way. The Shach says that the chalav that was sitting, the tzalul that was sitting in the keva, becomes nevela. Because all of it now becomes aser. V'hachinami amrina l'kamon. Reish simin kuf aleph sif beis. The ein din chaticha rui l'skabed elim yisur machmas atzmo go nevelu basar v'chalav. V'im kein kan kivan shu davar maamid afilu be'elef lo batel. Just like we have a din of chaticha rui l'skabed is not batel, so too over here. Once the entire milk inside the keva becomes aser, so then in such a case, then the halacha should be that it should aser all the other milk that it's inside. That's put inside, because that's the din of Maamid. The din of Maamid is that it entirely becomes aser, that all of it becomes aser, and it then asers everything else b'kolshu, not just b'shishim. So skip in the Shach, and the Shach answers the kasha about halfway through Sivkat and Lamid. V'yeshlomer de dafka davar ha'mayimid she'aser me'atzmo mamish kagon nevela amrin de lo batel. Ma she'ein keinacha she'ein ha'ma'amid oser me'atzmo ela mishum taruvas basar b'chalav l'chein batel shapir. This is quite a chiddush. This is saying as follows. When do we say that a davar ha'mayimid is oser? We say a davar ha'mayimid is oser only when it of itself is entirely aser. So, what we've had up until now was kevas nevela. Kevas nevela is entirely aser. So, kevas nevela is entirely aser. So then, if it's maamid cheese, so then it's going to aser everything else. However, over here, what are we talking about? We're not talking about a case of where the chalav is entirely aser, but rather what happened is that the basar from the keva gave its rennet inside of the chalav, and then, so now we want to say that that entire mixture becomes aser, that's able to aser everything else. That is not correct. There, in the case of where you have the stomach that's giving over rennet inside of the chalav, so then that doesn't have the ability to aser b'mashu everything else. It's a little bit of a chiddush, because l'chura one would have said the opposite. One would have said that at the end of the day there's a davar ha'mayimid here, and once there's a davar ha'mayimid into the chalav, so then the chalav becomes entirely aser, and then that chalav should be aser everything else. But the Shach is mechadesh that once you have the davar ha'mayimid that itself is only becoming aser b'toras basar b'chalav, so then in such a case it's not going to aser everything else. It's a little bit of a chiddush, but that's the Shach's yisod. Okay, so yes.
That has to be assuming that when there's a creation of basar b'chalav, it's not creating a new chetzer shara. Meaning, once you got,
and it sounds like it's a chiddush in Maamid. It sounds like it's a chiddush in Maamid. It sounds like that
the chalav inside is not considered a tarus of basar b'chalav. That's not the problem.
No, because it would just be a tarus of basar b'chalav, then it should, then the Ramah works. Then it's going to be aser if it gives shishim in the first chalav. But here we want to say that it's a maamid, and since it's a maamid, the first chalav is a maamid. It's going to be aser everything b'mashu. Here we're saying that davar maamid doesn't work that way. That this maamid is different. A maamid when you're being maamid into chalav, that's going to be different than when you're going to be maamid nevela into chalav. When it's maamid nevela into chalav, then boom, then it asers mashu, and then it has the ability to aser everything else b'mashu. Here, since it's not a maamid of nevela, it's a maamid of basar b'chalav, so then that basar b'chalav is only going to aser b'mashu, maser b'nosein tam, only aser b'nosein tam. Yes.
I think the Shach was saying also, if I'm not mistaken, that if it was basar b'chalav d'oraisa, then it would be aser b'mashu. He just said just because it's kadosh and malach, then it's batal b'shisha. But he said that if it was bishul, if it would be basar b'chalav d'oraisa, it would be similar to the.
Right. That's where he quotes from the Rabbeinu Shimshon ben Avram.
Yeah.
Right. He quotes that from the Rabbeinu Shimshon ben Avram that that if we were talking about a basar b'chalav d'oraisa, so then in such a case, then the halacha would be the same, and the reason for that is question is what's the svara for that?
I think that's what Yitzhak was saying. Like it becomes a real chefta shalis,
because then it's no different than nevela.
Exactly.
Then it becomes no different than nevela. Once it has that, then right, correct. Right, Kenny's being Mosif that if we were talking about the way we were masbir, the Rama is correct. Kenny's just adding that if we weren't talking about kavush, but if we were talking about, let's say you cook basar b'chalav together, not our case of where it was soaking, but you cooked the two together, then if you used it as a maamid, so let's just be clear on what the case would be. Let's say you cooked basar b'chalav together, and in that basar b'chalav there was rennet. And you took that basar b'chalav and you put it into a little bit of chalav, so then it's an iser machmas atzmo. If it's an iser machmas atzmo, then in such a case it wouldn't be shishim, and then it would be aser b'mashu. And this halacha was because the reason we were able to say that you were able to look at shishim from the second chalav is because you didn't have a full-fledged iser atzmo to create that maamid. That's correct. That's what the Shach says.
You can't say, I guess I understood the story, the original story, that's two of it. I mean, it's just saying, once we can make it, even if it's a chetza basar b'chalav, that's asr me'atzmo, the status of maamid doesn't necessarily spread to the entire chetza.
Right. So he's saying like this. He's saying that once something is a full-fledged basar b'chalav, and it is being maamid something else, then it'll have to asr.
The whole chalav being maamid, just a piece of the.
But the maamid itself, it's a maamid of basar b'chalav. It's a maamid of basar b'chalav, and therefore it's osir b'mashu. The heter over here is that at the end of the day, it's not a full-fledged iser machmas atzmo. If it's not a full-fledged iser machmas atzmo, so then it'll follow the regular rules of shishim. Okay, so that's the shach in Sif Katan Lamed, a very, very beautiful shach. Okay. These are the most important klalim of how Maamid is working over here. The Ramah then, most of the Ramah then moves smoothly. The Ramah continues, V'em haya hakeva krusha eino seres klum. This is the Ramah passing like Rabbeinu Tam, that if the keva was karush, in other words, the milk in the keva is karush, then it doesn't aser. Afil lo yishishim b'chalav neged hakeva l'das Rabbeinu Tam. V'em haya hakeva tzol mitchila v'nikrash yesh lo din solo. And if it starts out as being tzol, then it became nikrash. But as long as it started at one time, it was tzolul, so we have to view it as tzolul. V'yesh mekilim baza, and there's some who are mekil. V'makom have said yesh lahakil. Okay, tov. We now go on from, these cases don't happen that often today, but we will go on to modern examples of it, and the modern examples actually relate to the next part of the Ramah. Up until now, I'm sure there are cases where it comes up, but the most common modern examples are really the end of the Ramah. For whatever reason you didn't follow something, that is, you'll be okay. Because if you didn't follow something in the shach, you'll still be able to follow with the rest of our discussion. Moshe, you want to ask something before? No? Okay. The Ramah continues, and the Ramah tells us two more halachos. Again, I'm going to go out of order. I'm going to do first the Ramah in Yud Aleph, and then we're going to come back to the Ramah over here in Or HaKeva. The Ramah concluding Pei Zayin writes as follows. He says, "V'dafke shelo haya sham maamid acher, rak aser." So we learned that the halacha is, the first rule that we learned today, is that if you have a nevela, and the nevela is maamid something, so if you made cheese, you curdled cheese in the cave of a nevela, the halacha is that it's going to be maamid, it's going to be aser. But what happens if you have both heter and iser that are creating the maamid? The modern example of it, in those days, is probably you had a combination of a kosher cow and a non-kosher cow. Nowadays, you could have chemicals where you have some chemicals that are kosher and some chemicals that are not kosher, and they're combining together to be Maamid. We're going to have to define a little bit what it means to be Maamid today, but that would be a modern example of it. So says the Rama, "V'mhoyisham gamkein Maamid heter havi zeveze gorem umuter im ika shishim neged ha'isur." That if you have zeveze gorem, so then in such a case, where it's not only one thing that's creating the Maamid, but it's two things that are creating the Maamid, so then in such a case, it's going to be mutter. So let's go with the modern example. Let's say you're curdling cheese, and you're using a chemical of Isser, and you're using a chemical of Heter, so you're curdling the cheese with chemical of Isser, chemical of Heter. That's the sugya of Zeveh Gorim. So that sugya appears in Avodah Zarah and Sanhedrin, and the Shach says we have a parallel to that in the Gemara, essentially a parallel, not perfect parallel, but the Shach says, "Nir dafki kishein isi yochel hamid levado below heter halav hachyaser." This would only be that, let's say we're going to discuss a tshuva from Rav Belsky in regards to, let's say you're hardening a yogurt. Basically, if you think about it, making a yogurt hard, how different is that from taking milk and turning into cheese? So now, if you're hardening a yogurt, so that would be an example of a Maamid as well. So you have chemicals that are kosher, let's say from a kosher animal, chemicals that are from a non-kosher animal. So then says the Shach, so let's say you have the yeast of both truma and chulun, the sugya of Zagorim I've always found very, very difficult, but actually I think this is the easiest case of Zev Zagorim. In Nedarim, it's very much more complicated cases. So this might be the best case of Zev Zagorim to remember in Shas. We know that the amazing power of fermentation is such that if you have yeast, by the way, yeast in the time of Chazal is different than yeast today. Now it's a chemical. But once upon a time, when you would have bread that would ferment, so that has the ability to cause other bread to rise as well, which is the beginning of the process of fermentation. So if you have both truma and you have chulin, and they are causing other things to ferment, so then in such a case, the halacha is that if each one of them would not have been able to cause the fermentation by itself, that's called zeveh goring. So even though the truma is 50%, but if it can't create the fermentation without the chulin, so then the halacha is zeveh goring is going to be mutter. Says the Shach, that's the makar for this din of zeveh goring. Zeveh goring is going to be mutter. So when it comes to Maamid, even though Maamid is going to be aser even bekolshu, and that means if you use a chemical of a nevela to cause amada in a yogurt, so then in such a case that's going to be problematic. Nevertheless, if it's zeveh zagorim, it's going to be mutter. Okay, that's Ramah number one that is also relevant lamaisa, and we'll come back. Ramah number two is the conclusion of this Ramah. After the Ramah got through with the karush, and the halacha is that's going to aser only shishim, and the Ramah says ar hakeva lepamim molchanoso umiyabshinoso. So here the Ramah describes that what happens if you're no longer talking about the stomach of an animal, a functional stomach of an animal, but rather you dry it out like wood. It's very interesting. The Ramah describes the nasa ke'etz. Mamish is entirely dried out. Now it seems that it's possible to dry it out without the power of the rennet being entirely lost. So let's say you dry out the arakeva. So this is a fascinating chiddush of the Shibboleh Leket. Interestingly, the Beis Yosef quotes the name of Shibboleh Leket. He himself doesn't quote it in the Shulchan Aruch, but the Ramah quotes it. So everything that we learned about the problems of Maamid doesn't apply if we're talking about something that's entirely dried out. Now you can imagine, Rabbosai, that this throwaway line Ramah with a throwaway shach will actually have tremendous halacha l'maisa implication that turn on this question, because we have many materials nowadays that come from non-kosher sources, but at the same time they started out as being not kosher, but you're miyabesh it. So what's the status going to be? So let's take a look at the shach, the Pri Megadim, and then Emir Hashem see how important these halachos are. Says the shach lamigimel, Ora keva lepa'amim, v'hu adin shar b'nei ma'ayim, kishemiyabshin osa ad shenasu ke'etz. Any type of part of an animal, of an avela, if you dry it out and it becomes like wood, the halacha is that it's not going to have the original din that it had. So the Ramah was talking about doing Maamid. The shach could be talking about, you don't do Maamid and B'nai Me'ayim. It sounds like he's saying that the food, that this item is not going to be usher. Now, people don't eat pieces of wood, excuse me. So if this meat has been turned mamish into wood, so we need to ask exactly how he's imbibing it. But nevertheless, mi'ikr dedina, it's no longer considered the midei me'ayim of the animal. It's no longer considered the keva of the animal. The shach does conclude, mikol makom nirad lechatchila in lasos kain. But he says, lechatchila, you should not do this. Lechatchila, you should not rely on the fact that it's entirely dried out and not considered b'nei me'ayim and not considered keva. Tov comes along the Pri Megadim, and the question is why? Why is it even aser lechatchila? So the Pri Megadim seems to say in Sifkat Lam Gimel, the misrachech v'nosein tam, that there are times that you could cook it and it could still give off tam. So it's true that when it's dried out entirely, then really there's no reason it should be usher to imbibe it altogether. However, the problem is that even if you dried it out ke'etz, at the end of the day, it could very well be that it has still lachluchis, and it's possible to do a tchias hamesim, if you will, on this dried out thing, which would emerge that according to the Pri Megadim, it would seem that the halacha is, if it's impossible to do tchias hamesim to the thing, that's mamish entirely dried out, so then in such a case, the halacha would be that's going to be heter gomer. So Rabbosai, what we've now seen is that we've gone from the halachos of keva in terms of the process of curdling and cheese making, and we've now gone to a place of the item itself, when it becomes entirely inedible, becomes ke'etz ba'alma, it loses its identity as macholos asuros. Take a look at the Pischei Teshuvos of Kana Chafaf. Yes, Yehuda?
Didn't we also note that according to at least one of the Rambam read that a chila shalok derech and basar
very good
is, so what would be the difference here? Meaning, even if it's not something shalok, like it could be like an eitz which shalok derech, but even if you ate it, like let's say you cooked challah with it, so then that should now have a status of basar challah.
Very good. So Rav Aaron Kotler makes a similar point to what you're making. I'm going to get to that. Mirtz Hashem. What you're pointing out is that the heter over here is that it's based on the idea that it's eina ru'iyah leger, right? That's eina ru'iyah leger. Yeah, but atzamos themselves are eina ru'iyah leger. But what happens if you have atzamos that are entirely dried out? In other words, it seems to me that there's two dargas. There's a darga of atzamos where you have the atzamos is not normally not eaten, but it's not eitz ba'alma. And then you have something that you've turned into mamish eitz ba'alma. But you're right, how that relates to sugi of eina ru'iyah leger is going to be important later on as well, nevertheless. Even though my understanding is that this is not like stam atzamos or shilya and so on and so forth. Right? You have shilya, and then you have shilya when you turn it into eitz ba'alma. Those are going to be two different things. Which brings us back to the shilya discussion. Maybe the shilya, we have to process it also that maybe it's eitz ba'alma. And how does it come to that? Yeah.
Can the difference be that when we say it's not that achila, we still view the food
as an
as
ochel.
an ochel.
Correct.
Here when he says it's ke'etz, it's
That's right. It's not an ochel at all. Correct. So the Pischei Tshuva has this in Sifkat and Chaf Aleph. He quotes the Pri Megadim, and he quotes that there is a sefer called Lechem Apanim that disagrees with this Pri Megadim. He says Amnam, so that's in Sifkat and Chaf Aleph there. Then he says Amnam b'tshuvas Tferet Tzim mevur deloka Pri Megadim el degam basar yavish eina oser mevur af al yidei shri me'es leis nam mishari. The Tferet Tzvi goes even further, and he says, even if you soak it, the halacha would be, and you resuscitate it, the halacha is that it's going to be mutter. In other words, the Pri Megadim only said it's going to be mutter when it's mamish eitz. If you soak it again, he says, and you resuscitate it, then it's going to be mutter. The Tferet Tzvi is even more lenient. Tferet Tzvi says that the halacha is that once it became eitz ba'alma, then it's going to be mutter. Okay, so this is a little bit of a debate as far as is it the pshat that the lachluchas has been removed. It's just that we're concerned that not all of it has been removed, and that's why the shach is answering lechatchila. V'haraya, says the Sifsei Das, it's aser lechatchila, but when it's eitz ba'alma, it's going to be mutter. If you find lachluchas, it's going to be fine. Or the Tferet Tzvi holds that once it becomes basar yavesh, then it loses its identity of basar also, even if you manage to soak it again. Of course, when you're soaking again, what are you doing? You're adding exterior moisture. But it of itself, it's already dead. What's dead is dead. And that's it. There's no such thing as tchias hamesim on a limb of an animal. So there's no tchias hamesim. It's eitz ba'alma. It's dead. While the Pri Megadim is always worried that maybe there's also a little bit of leichus. So right now it's dead, but it's possible to reawaken it. Yes, Ella.
Just on Yehuda's question, maybe the answer is that Pri Megadim and Avdama writes that even shalok derech achilas, if it's only basar b'chala, it's already basar b'chala. But if you have the basar alone, it's shalok derech achila, and then you add milk to that, that's not considered to be asar.
It's not going to be. You see, I thought what also he was bothered by is that the Rambam writes. We're going to see a Rambam that the Rambam writes that it's still asar midrabanan to eat it shalok derech. That's why I thought Yehuda was asking.
I mean, I was kind of bothered by both.
By both kashas. In other words, I thought he was asking like this, that even when it comes to Atzamos, it could be your question, I thought he was bothered that even when it comes to Atzamos is only Asam Midrabanan, it's not Heter Gomer. And you're addressing a different question, right? Okay. So let's try to go do Keseder, and okay. So this is the debate in terms of the Das of the Shach. Lekule Alma, though, what emerges is that when it's Yavesh Legamri, then the halacha is that it's going to be what? When it's Yavesh Legamri, the halacha is that it's going to be mutter. If it's Yavesh Legamri, except L'chatchila in Lasos Kain. So what does that mean? It sounds like, but B'di'evid, if it was already done, so then even according to the Shach, it's going to be mutter. Fine. This Rabbosai takes us to some very, very exciting halacha l'maisa cases as well. Our goal is not just to get to halacha l'maisa. Our goal is to understand the sugya, but definitely the interface with halacha l'maisa is very fascinating, very important also. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank has the following shaila. It's in the back of your booklet, the second to last page in your booklet. In Yeridei and Simin Pei Beis, he describes the following case. Nish'alti, im mutar lahamid chalav al yidei avaka o kadurim ktanim hamurkavim mechomer shel or hakeva v'gam me'urav behem od chomer shel mamidim acher mimini hatzmachim. So, in those days, it wasn't so simple to get milk. So they would often have certain concoctions. You guys heard powdered milk, right? So, but the powder, the kanireh, the milk was the amount of powdered milk that the amount of milk in the powdered milk was so weak that they would throw in other animal derivatives lahamid in order to be maamid the milk. Now, of course, now the shaila is a shaila of Maamid. So you have powder animal derivatives and powdered milk, and the concoction is there. The animal derivative is there to be Maamid the milk. Okay, so Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank starts with our Diyun. He says that once it's Eitz Ba'alma, once we have a keva that's Eitz Ba'alma, is it a keva that's Eitz Ba'alma have the ability to do Maamid? The answer is no, it doesn't have the ability to do Maamid. He then says, and there's a machlokus haposkim how to understand it, that Rabbi Akiva Eiger said what we had said from the Pri Megadim, the chayshina dilma lo nisyavish legamri. But if there's shishim, then in such a case, the halacha is that there isn't the problem of emavatl and sechatchila. Then he quotes our Tferes Tzvi, shafilim chozer v'nisrachech ha'idei shuyim eisleis mutter v'asam sham shekem avur b'shach. That the halacha is that even if you resuscitated the animal derivative, that you made it no longer eitz, but you put it into this concoction, so then in such a case it still would be mutter. That's a position of Tferes Tzvi. But he points out the Pri Megadim might be more machmir in this regard. So that's how Tzvi Pesach Frank begins the shayla. So he says l'chura it should be a machlokes Pri Megadim and Tferes Tzvi. However, he then concludes, but what about our other Ramah? What did we learn in the other Ramah? We learned that Zev Gorem is mutter. So now, if the only thing that is being Maamid, this milk, is going to be the animal derivatives, and it could do it on its own, so then it's not Zev Gorem. But if you have, his case had Minei Tzmachim, it also had other chemicals from other sources, and the animal derivatives are not enough, so then he says, then l'kulei alma, it's going to be mutter. So this is Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank's application, if you will, of these two halachos. Very, very beautiful. Very sweet. Okay? It's always very sweet when you have a very difficult sugya and you have someone who's applying it lamaisa. You then feel more comfortable seeing also the application of the concepts become clearer sometimes when we see how they're applied. Very good. So that's Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank Zatzal's heter. This tshuva of Tzvi Pesach Frank is less of, it's very important tshuva, but less common than the massive sugya of gelatin that emerges from our sugya as well. And here is we have the debate, and here is the discussion where Yehuda, what Yehuda had raised comes up. And that is the following. From this halacha, from this shach, we could derive the following yisod. Remember, it emerged from the shach, just again the development of the making of a tshuva of Achiezer is we have to see how the steps worked. So the first step was we had the din of keva. The keva that is already mityabesh, so then al pi halacha, its rennet is not considered meat at all. Neither nevela, nor is it going to be considered basar. Once it's dried out. The shach then went, is it one line shach, Rabbosai, right? So one line shach. The shach then says 5 words. The shach says, and the same will apply to b'nei me'ayim. So what's the shach? How are we interpreting the shach? What's the shach saying? The shach is saying that once you have something that's become entirely dried out, it loses its identity of the machalos asuris. So that's what gelatin is. Points out Reb Chaim Meiser in the tshuva. So Reb Chaim Meiser was one of the big mekilim in regards to gelatin. What is gelatin? It seems that in about 120, 130 years ago is when they began to really developing the art of this chemical. So basically what gelatin is it's bones that have been entirely dried out, that are then ground down into the Achiezer is Siman Lamed Gimel Sif Hey. It's the 4th to last page in your booklet. That what gelatin is it's bones that have been entirely dried out and then ground down into a powder. And this powder actually, who would have thought, has a very, very strong gummy-like substance when you mix it with water and other chemicals. So hence, gummy bears and stuff like that are one of the best ways, most effective ways of creating that gummy type of thing, or thickness. What it does is it creates thickness. The gelatin creates thickness. So that's the way they did it. So and to this day, that is one of the big differences between candy under a Rabbanut Hashgacha and candy under quote unquote Mahadran Hashgachas. Candy that's under a Rabbanut Hashgacha, the Rabbanut traditionally followed this heter, the Achiezer that we're about to quote, and that the candy, even if it was made from bones of an animal that was nevela or treifa or tmeya and so on, that's still going to be kosher because the bones were entirely dried out, and now it's not considered, it loses its identity as food. And so therefore it's kosher. Gelatin from a non-kosher animal is going to be kosher. In general, that's one of the big differences between the OU and the Rabbanut. In Eretz Yisrael, the great poskim of the Rabbanut at time of Hakamat Medina and even prior, so they were of the opinion that it was appropriate to follow this heter. Again, there's Reb Chaim Oizer. It's not a slouch who had been mater. That was appropriate to follow the heter. While in America they had decided to be more lenient, and the reason they were more lenient in America is because of a brisker lamdus that Reb Aaron Kotler has. If you take a look, the most famous Baal Memra in this was Reb Aaron Zatzal. In Mishnah's Reb Aaron, in Siman Yud Zayin, he declares a beautiful chakira. He declares the following chakira. He says, when it comes to bones, what's the reason that bones are not going to be an Isser D'Oraisa? Now here, I think we're talking about bones that's not Yovesh. It's not Yovesh Lagamri, but bones. Bones in general. So bones in general, the halacha is that the reason why it's not an Isser D'Oraisa is because it's not considered Ein Ruyin L'Achila. So if it's Ein Ruyin L'Achila, so then in such a case, Hareza Potter. So what's the reason that it's Potter? And what's the reason that's considered Nevela Shein Ruyi Leger? How do you understand the din of Nevela Shein Ruyi Leger? Reb Aaron says. Do you say the din of Nevela Shein Ruyi Leger is the pshat that it doesn't have a Chalos Shem Isser? Since it's Nevela, the pasuk says Isser Achila, Lo Sochel Nevela. So you can't eat a Nevela. If the Nevela is not Ra'ui to eat, so then in such a case, then it's not called Nevela. Or do you say, no, that's not called Nevela, but rather the pshat is that it might still be considered Nevela, but if it's Eina Ru'uya, so then the halacha is it's not considered Derech Achilasan. It's not considered Derech Achilasan. So two tzadim. Here, let's see it in Reb Aaron's own words on page Samach Daled. V'yesh l'stapik be'etzem aptur. Aleph im aptur mitzad ein elu ru'in achil v'havile sheklo k'derech achilasa depater. V'chein mitzad zeh yesh gam ptur d'chol nevela shein ru'i leger ein akru'i nevela. That's also the din of ein ru'i leger. V'din zeh shayach gam b'tmeim. Shegam behem be'in shi ru'i leger u'k'derech achilasam. U'meila fi zeh yisod aptur u'kiniskalel mitzad shein ru'im l'achila. That's one side. Beis yesh shafarish b'ofen acher. That the din of Ein Ru'i Leger tells us that's not called the Isser. The Torah didn't aser it, rak besaram, only the basar v'lo elu. Since it's Ein Ru'i, it's not called a Chefza Shel Isser. So is the Ptur, the reason why it's not Isser D'Oraisa is because it is Ein Ru'i Leger, or is it because it's not considered a Chefza of Machalos Asuris altogether? So Reb Aaron said very sharply, he said, the nafkamina is going to be what happens if you do Tchias HaMesim on something that's Ein Ru'i Leger. If we're going to say the pshat is that Ein Ru'i Leger is a simin that's not called Machalos Asuris, so the moment in which these atzamos have reached the point that everybody agrees there's no leichos, etc., etc. So then, and even the Pri Megadim is going to agree where there's no leichos, etc., etc. So then, in such a case, then everybody would hold that it's not considered it's not considered Isser anymore. However, if the pshat is that it's not Asr now, it's Heter Gomer now when it's Ein Ru'ya. So of course, if you take the powder of the gelatin before it's turned into a gummy bear, so then and you eat it, then of course that's not going to be a chefza shel Isser. But it's possible to resuscitate it, because the reason why it was mutter to eat the gelatin powder is because it was ein roi leger. But now it's roi leger. It's hadra. There's tchias hamesim. It's hadra liisura. Kanireh, Reb Chaim Oizer assumed that it's not edible now. It's the fact that it's not edible shows us that it's no longer a chefza of machalos asuros. That was Reb Chaim Oizer's psak. So, from a quote from my teenagehood, we didn't start the fire. At the end of the day, this is a machlokis that goes back dore for a couple of generations now. And Nahara Upashte, at the end of the day, Reb Chaim Oizer claims that there's no shita that we saw anywhere in Siman Pei Zayin that said that the halacha is that it should be aser. There's no makar that we saw anywhere of this idea of tchias hamesim. Rav Aaron Kotler says, if you take a look at the Rambam, that's what the Rambam is saying. This comes back to what Yehuda had mentioned. Now, that's Yehuda's point. Just the paragraph before, he quotes the Rambam. The Rambam's lashon was, if you eat from that samos, afal pishu aser hareze pater bnei she'elu einu ruim lachila. It's not roy lachila. Now, I understood, by the way, Yehuda, that he says when the Rambam says afal pishu aser, it means that it's something that's not normal for people to eat. But at the end of the day, it's not yavesh ke'etz. It will be yavesh ke'etz because otherwise I can't make sense of the shach and the later poskim. That's why I assumed. But that was an assumption I was making. Either way, leaving aside that point that I'm responding to Yehuda about, at the end of the day, Rav Aaron Kotler points out in the Lashon Rambam, Pnei she'elu einu ruyin lachila. The whole heter is based on the idea that's not roy lachila. But now it's a tchias hamesim. So it could very well be, it's a question of how big of a deal do you make of a lumdus in a Rambam? Is a lumdus in a Rambam for Rav Aaron Kotler, a lumdus in a Rambam will be koveya the halacha? It could be that for Reb Chaim Oizer, it might be less likely, even though Reb Chaim Oizer was the ultimate lamdin. Reb Chaim Oizer, I think, was chavrusas with Reb Chaim in Volozhin. He quotes in a couple of chuvas, he quotes Yedidi Chaim mi Volozhin. That's how he refers to Reb Chaim Brisker. They were close from their days in Volozhin as Bachurim. So Chaim Oizer also knew how to learn a Rambam. But at the end of the day, it could be Reb Chaim Oizer was taking the classic Shaus Uchuvas approach. The pashtus of what's in front of us in Siman Pei Zayin is that it's mutter. Reb Aaron was starting again from a lamdus, and that's how he builds his whole piece, his whole tshuva. Of course, by the way, I'm just taking a tiny bit. Don't think that if you learn with Chaim Eisenstein 15 minutes this Reb Aaron Kotler that you know the whole Reb Aaron Kotler. It's a long tshuva. It's rewarding to go through it, but it's very intense. You get a taste of Reb Aaron's derech halimud also in this. It's true. It's quite intense. But for smicha, for halacha shir, this is enough to know that Reb Aaron went with this idea that the mashmos of the Rambam of ein ruya leger is something that is maybe the best word in English would be that it is. Oh gosh. It's in flux. In other words, Einu Ruya Leger is another word that I'm looking for. But Einu Ruya Leger is something that is not a chalos, that it becomes heter. But Einu Ruya Leger is subjective. It's another word I'm looking for. That's right. It's not static. What's the antithesis of static? Dynamic. That's not bad. That Einu Ruya Leger is not. Dynamic is better. So that is dynamic. In other words, it's not static. That it has one din, but it's something that can be in flux. So and now it's ein ruya leger doesn't mean that it's going to have the identical error. Yes, Moshe.
You say as far for Wizard that he agrees with the Rambam that meaning at Maamid it's not right achila. So it should be according to the way that. Father wants to learn is that it's usher because now it's edible.
Right.
Chaim Ozer would say, okay, now it's edible, but it already lost the status of something. So he could even agree for Rambam about right l'achila or not, and okay, now it's right l'achila, but it's a totally different shame, right? When you grind it up, and you
Right, but Reb Aaron is going to say, the mashmos from the Rambam is that its entire shame is dependent whether it's right l'achila. And I agree with him that it is the pashtus of the Rambam.
Right.
The pashtus is, the chalosh shem heter is by definition dynamic. By definition dynamic. It's dynamic in the sense that right now it's ein real ger. But if tomorrow it is roy ger, then it would be different. You want to say that Reb Chaim Ozer is going to say that once it became ein real ger, then it has a chalosh shem heter.
Well, it's just a totally different colors.
Right.
And once
Right.
go up and down so long as it's within the
Right, but the
color.
words of Ein Ruli Ger sound like it's not a question of whether it has a new chalois or not.
Well, what's Ru'uya? Meaning, well, what's the thing that we're describing?
Once it lost its identity,
Gelatin, it's
then
gelatin.
it lost its identity entirely. Yeah, I hear. Then if it could fit in the Rambam, I hear what you're saying. Let's wrap up with a very practical application of this. Rav Belsky Zatzal was asked two questions in regards to Davar Maamid in yogurt. I'm going to focus on the second one, but please feel free to do the other one as well. On the bottom of page 355, by the way, if you don't know him by name, you know him by face. Rabbi Gordimer davens in the Beis Medrash, often in New York. Do you know who he is? He's a very special Talmud Chacham, and he works for the OU. But there are a few people who work for the OU who daven in the YU Beis Medrash that you don't even know who they are. For my days, they were the top guys in the Beis Medrash. So Rabbi Gordimer is one of them. So he writes as follows on the bottom of 355. Rabbi Gordimer raised a concern about some yogurt products in which the gelatin may in fact be a davar hamaimid. A whip yogurt uses a gelatin-based stabilizer. Here, the original mixture is a very thick base, and the final product is light and fluffy. So if you have you have a yogurt that starts off with a very thick base, and what happens is they added gelatin to the yogurt. Without the gelatin, the yogurt would not hold the nitrogen and it would be flat. So in the yogurt, what makes it fluffy is nitrogen, and the way in which the nitrogen is held is through the gelatin. Rav Belsky felt that this situation, gelatin, would be a davar hamaimid. Rav Belsky compared the effect of the gelatin in this situation to the effect that yeast has on bread. So Rabbosai, the first time I read this, I didn't realize this is classic Rav Belsky. Rav Belsky is just going back to the Gemara, right? The Gemara that we saw in the Shach. The Shach quoted the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, that when you have sar, so that's what Rav Belsky was doing. Here, whoever wrote this up didn't spell this out, but I'm quite sure that's what Rav Belsky was doing. He was making reference to that Gemara. When the yeast is added to the dough, the microorganisms in the yeast consume the sugar in the dough and release carbon dioxide. So basically, Rav Belsky Darko B'Kodesh was telling us exactly what was the chemical phenomenon of that Gemara. The addition of the carbon dioxide gas to the dough gives the dough a new texture. So that's the Beferish Gemara, that the Gemara said that it's possible for it to be considered a problem of being gorim. Similarly, when gelatin is added to yogurt, it enables the nitrogen air to stay in the yogurt, giving it an airy texture. Interestingly, Moreinu Rav Shechter Shlita Yibad L'Chaim responded that it's not Mikra Dedin al B'Toras Chumra. But I didn't ask Rav Shechter exactly what he meant by that. So we could be mefalpel in the Beis Medrash. What exactly? Why there's kanira machlokis over here between Rav Belsky, a subtle machlokis over here between Rav Belsky and Rav Shechter. Rav Belsky said that it would be a full-fledged davar hamaimid, and Rav Shechter felt that this was only a chumrah. I would imagine that the reason was that Rav Shechter was probably arguing that the whole idea, if it's only about the nitrogen, that's not enough to be considered a full. That's a chumrah of maamid. It's not what maamid is. What maamid is not only that it's playing around with the nitrogen or the carbon dioxide inside nitrogen. What maamid is doing is it's changing the whole chemical makeup of the milk and turning it into cheese. Presumably that's what. But I didn't hear this from him, so I'm just speculating. As just almost like a humorous aside, you take this tongue in cheek. One time I was discussing with Rav Shechter something Rav Belsky had said, and something they disagree with, and Rav Shechter, I think again, he said tongue in cheek, said, whatever I write, Rav Belsky always says the exact opposite. That's what he said. Whatever I say, he says the exact opposite, which makes for very, very exciting the chuvas back and forth over here. But that's a fun example to see in the OU, a fun example of Dar Maamid. Okay, the Siyata D'Shmaya, where we can make a siyum on Siman Pei Zayin, Baruch Hashem, for the first time around, and we're going to continue with Siman Pei Ches. It worked out okay that we'll only have one day of preparation because I know it's not easy. Some of you tend to be chazering the shir. Try not only to do chazar in the shir, but also to see what we're going to do the next day, because especially like a sugi of Davar Maamid, if you didn't see it beforehand, it's hard to follow in shir. But here, the sugi of the Isser Halah is not as complicated as Maamid. It's a beautiful sugi Siman Pei Ches, so that Emir Hashem we'll start with on Thursday. So you have today and tomorrow, and we'll have shir on Thursday. We'll get back to regular schedule. Yeah.
How are you going to mark your Maamid exactly? It's just it changes something significantly?
Right. So it seems from the language of the poskim over here that the difference between I forgot to mention that the Drisha says there are two things that are not batal. Something that's Avida L'Taima and Davar Maamid. Avida L'Taima, the example in Shulchan Aruch is if you have a tavlin of truma, something like that. So those, for two different reasons, both of them are not batal b'shisha. So coming back, the answer to your question, I think, is like this. It's a Lashon HaGemara, Kima de'okim kamokim. Since its role in the ingredients are not just tam, its role affects the whole identity of it, so then it's by definition chashuv and not batal. That's how I understand it. Yosef Mordechai had an interesting take of Kivin to Okim Kamokim. Right? How do you want to say it? Not for now. You want to work on it more. Okay. But Pashas, that's how I understand. Kivin to Okim Kamokim, so that's what's happening going in all the cases that we're discussing. We think about Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank's case, Rav Shechter's case, Rav Belsky's case with the yogurt, and so on. All those cases are cases in which the tzura is being... Go ahead, Yosef Mordechai. Yehuda, yeah.
Can you be mechal possibly because the gelatin's not really doing anything, like versus yeast, like you're actually it's breaking down the sugar, and then that comes the carbon dioxide.
Yeah,
but here just time is just in there. Yeah, it's trapping the nitrogen. It's not like there's no like.
Right. And, well, but that's not what Maamid works by cheese. You're explaining.
Maamid that we saw by challah and Maamid that he just showed at least by gluten.
Right.
So when the gluten like breaks down, when the microorganisms break down the gluten,
right.
So then it creates, meaning the sugar is digested and then it creates carbon dioxide,
right,
which then causes the fermentation.
Right.
But so that would be the same thing by like challah, because like challah it breaks down the proteins.
The proteins.
And then through that comes the cheese.
Right.
It's like coagulated proteins. But like
right.
So shouldn't the same like by yogurt it's not, meaning all it's doing is holding down the nitrogen. It's not really
right.
acting on the.
Right. In other words, you want to say that. And that's probably what Rav Shechter meant by the Chumrah, right? In other words, you want to say that even though Rav Belsky argued that there's a release of a chemical that's causing the expansion, right?
According to this, it doesn't even sound like there's a release. It just sounds like it's in there to trap nitrogen. Like
no. I meant his dimyon to bread, to sa'ar. That's what. Yeah. So you're saying that over there, it's not only a release but there's actually the way you said it, the gluten is and so on doing something. And as opposed to, I hear that, and that probably
like all Davar Maamid is like it's something that like is mamish, like something's taking effect based off of
right.
In there. Here it just like the nitrogen wasn't there and it just helps stabilize it and be there. It's not like
I like that.